Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Job Accommodation Network webcast titled Key Interactive Process Strategies. My name is Tracy, and I am joined today by my JAN colleague, Lisa. We'll get right into the training overview. We have a lot to talk about today. We know that successful employment outcomes achieved through the interactive accommodation process truly hinge on effective communication among all parties involved. And this JAN training on key interactive process strategies emphasizes the significance of constructive dialogue and collaborative exploration to find reasonable workplace accommodation solutions that meet the diverse needs of workers with disabilities. Participants will receive key strategies for facilitating accommodation discussions and learn about JAN services and resources designed to support the interactive process. The training will be 60 minutes in duration. On some of the PowerPoint slides, you'll notice an icon next to the slide number. One icon represents employers and is three people around a desk. The other represents an individual and is a single head. Slides with these icons have either an employer or an individual focus, but keep in mind that all of the slides are relevant to both parties, regardless of the icon. So you'll find the information useful in whichever category you fall into. Now, Lisa, I'm going to turn things over to you to get us started with the training content.
All right, thank you and welcome. Quickly, in case any of the attendees are new to the JAN webcast series and you guys don't know exactly what we do here at the Job Accommodation Network, we're a national free consulting service we were established in 1983. Even before the ADA was a law, we were providing helpful information on workplace accommodations. We pride ourselves on being the leading source of expert confidential guidance on workplace accommodations. We serve customers from all over the United States. We provide one-on-one consultation for that technical assistance on workplace accommodation solutions, trusted accommodation process strategies, what we're going to get into today, and then also practical guidance on the employment realm of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I of the ADA. JAN is a service of the U.S. Department of Labor, Office of Disability Employment Policy. Our central office is located here in Morgantown, West Virginia. We reside on the campus of West Virginia University. So, looking at why do we provide reasonable accommodations? Why are they so important to provide? Job accommodations provide a vital role in increasing employment opportunities for people that happen to have disabilities. These changes or modifications in the work environment or changes from the way things are customarily done, which is an accommodation, this enables people with disabilities to equal employment opportunities. They're essential for elevating the productivity and performance of not only the employees with disabilities, but of all the workforce, of all the employees. So reasonable accommodations can help employers attract good employees with various skills, various perspectives in times of labor shortages. Reasonable accommodations can help employers hire employees who are adaptable, flexible, capable. Accommodations also help employers retain an experienced workforce. We know that hiring and onboarding can get very, very costly very, very quickly. So let's keep the employees who know the job on the job via accommodations. And then, of course, accommodations can help employers meet legal obligations under the ADA or similar laws when applicable. Okay, so talking about accommodations, here at JAN, we've discovered that accommodations are often easy to implement, easier than we think they could be to implement. Accommodations are typically low in cost, and we know that they positively impact the workplace in many, many ways. So this is based on the ongoing results of a JAN survey that we do that really gauges an employer's motivations of why are you making an accommodation, and the accommodations you provided, are those even effective, and what are those resulting benefits, both direct and indirect benefits. So during this JAN study, we have found that in the vast majority of cases, employers do report the benefits of providing employees meaningful access to all aspects of the job outweigh the costs because hiring talented people with disabilities, it benefits the employee, benefits the employer, and benefits the workforce. So the report that's derived from this Jan survey that we do, we call it the low cost, high impact. Last updated April of last year. We do it annually. So this report had some key findings. We found that time and time again, most employers report a no cost or low cost for accommodating employees with disabilities. Over half, about 56% of employers that participated in the survey and provided cost information to us, they reported that those accommodations that they implement, they cost absolutely nothing. Some employers, around 37%, did report a one-time cost with a medium one-time expenditure of $300. So in the scheme of things, $300 to accommodate someone and the vast benefits for, like I said, not only that employee, but the whole workplace, it outweighs the costs of these accommodations. You can definitely dig into more details and more data. It's linked on the website and they've put it in the chat for us. And it, like I said, it has direct and indirect benefits and really gets into some interesting facts about providing accommodations. Okay, so we're talking about accommodations, but what exactly does an accommodation entail? What does that mean? A reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a job, the work environment, or the way things are customarily done that enables a qualified individual with a disability to enjoy an equal opportunity, employment opportunity. So the ADA, the federal law, does say that reasonable accommodations it requires employers to provide accommodations for people with disabilities who need them in the hiring process, to perform essential functions of the job, or to access equal benefits and privileges of employment. So what does reasonable even mean? Just this morning, I got an email of, are these accommodation requests reasonable? Well, what's reasonable mean? Really just that. Is it feasible? Is it plausible? Think, is it possible to provide this accommodation without causing an undue hardship to the employer? What does undue hardship mean? Undue hardship is defined as any action that requires significantly difficulty or expense to provide. It fundamentally alters the nature or operation of business. And that's a high threshold to meet. You can't just claim every accommodation is going to pose an undue hardship. You really need to look. It's a case-by-case determination. It's not a hard, fast dollar amount of an accommodation, and really assess, is this reasonable and can we provide it without causing hardship? An accommodation, it needs to be effective. It needs to enable an applicant with a disability or an employee with a disability to perform those essential job functions or participate in the interview application stage. Of course, you can get into more details on the EEOC formal guidance that talks about accommodation and undue hardship. So, how do employers know when to provide a reasonable accommodation? Basically, when you're made aware that a person with a disability needs an accommodation. So this means that an individual indicates that they're having difficulty or a problem in the hiring process or performing their job duties due to a health condition or a medical condition. If they explain they're having a medical condition and a problem, a barrier, a difficulty in the workplace, an employer should consider and take pause of, hey, is this person requesting an accommodation? Generally, the individual with a disability, they're in the best position to inform the employer that an accommodation is needed. Employers are typically not required to guess or make assumptions that people need accommodations in the workforce. Whenever someone is requesting an accommodation, plain language can be used. They probably don't need to use the formal term ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. They don't need to say the word reasonable accommodation whenever they're making these requests. A lot of these requests are going to come in just as plain English and very everyday language of, hey, I can't do this because of this medical condition or this limitation. I can't do this at work because of this. And we'll kind of get into more details here in a moment. So what is an accommodation request? The interactive process typically starts with recognizing that accommodation request. So it's important for an employer to be able to recognize a request. So anytime an employer indicates, again, that they need a work-related adjustment due to a health condition or a medical reason or a limitation, an employer should, again, consider, is this person making a formal request for an accommodation? Often there is no clear sign indicating that the ADA is triggered, but whenever there's that nexus between a health condition or disability or limitation or a restriction and a work-related issue or work-related barrier, it's typically time to engage in this interactive process. So on the slide here, you'll see some examples of what an accommodation request could look like. I'm neurodiverse and I need interview questions in advance. I'm having difficulty concentrating because of the side effects of medication. A healthcare provider's note requests 3 months of leave for medical treatment. So we also want to remember that accommodation request, it doesn't necessarily have to be the individual. Like I said, I know they're in the best position to make a request, but we should be ready to accept accommodation requests from other people, family members, healthcare providers, voc rehab counselors. Anyone could make a request on behalf of an individual if they know they need it, and we should consider that with our due diligence. Of course, here at JAN, we have a link and a resource to help employers recognize those accommodation requests. Like I said, these are pretty explicit examples of an accommodation request, but Tracy's going to get into the situations of a request that might not be so crystal clear.
All right, so let's do that. Thanks for setting that reasonable accommodation foundation, Lisa. So after recognizing an accommodation request, the employer should start an informal interactive process to gather information and clarify what the individual needs, and ultimately identify the appropriate reasonable accommodation. Now, the employer may ask relevant questions to help make an informed decision about the request. This includes asking what type of accommodation is needed, if to be direct about that. Of course, the exact nature of the dialogue will vary in every interactive process. But what if you're unsure whether an individual is requesting an accommodation? Sometimes this happens. So here's our first key strategy for our employers who are paying attention. So note that employer icon in the upper right side of the slide. We want to think about facilitating a collaborative dialogue with the employee. That's where we start, basically. So employers that are not sure whether an employee has requested an accommodation, they can ask the employee to clarify what's being requested and why. This kind of puts that onus, like Lisa talked about, on the individual to kind of explain why they've mentioned a disability or health condition or asked for a change at work. So you're really just kind of seeking some clarification there, and it's okay to do this. We do want to facilitate the conversation by asking something like, how can I help? Or what do you need to be successful? Or even, I want to clarify what you're asking for and why it's needed so I can find out what we can do to help. Sometimes employers are concerned about asking the wrong questions or saying the wrong things. A good best practice is to really just start with, what are you asking for and why? How can I help you? What can we do? So you can get that conversation moving forward. It can be a really safe way of creating that safe space for disability disclosure and a discussion about accommodations. And these questions don't make the employer vulnerable to appearing as if they are making assumptions about disability. Rather, this can really just be a good place or smart practice for seeking some clarification and also conveying support, showing that you're there to help and want to do what you can. So if you're unsure, that's a good approach to consider. Now, the next key strategies I'd like to share are for individuals who are considering requesting an accommodation. So again, note that individual icon at the top right. Jan often receives questions from employees who need an accommodation, but they're maybe not really sure how to approach the employer. So on this slide are some suggestions for requesting an accommodation. So the first thing you want to do, of course, is decide how you're going to make your request. This can be done face-to-face. It can be done via email, in a formal letter. I have heard of people texting that, but I probably wouldn't suggest that as the best approach. So maybe the email is the way to go. There are no official forms for making a request for accommodation. However, some employers do have their own forms and, of course, will have their own policy and procedures for going through this process. So you want to make sure you check on that. Now, Jan does offer some resources, including a sample accommodation request letter that'll kind of guide you through making that request for accommodation. So that's a good place to start, along with some sample language for accommodation request letters too. So we can kind of get you started on that path to requesting the accommodation. Next, of course, you want to decide who you're going to ask. You can initially let anyone in management know what you need. If there is a specific person in charge of accommodations, you could start with them. Of course, you could go directly to human resources as well. So that's up to you to decide who to make the request through, but it needs to be someone who can act on that request in some way. You'll, of course, also want to explain why you need an accommodation and give your accommodation ideas. Lisa and I were just talking about what does an accommodation request look like. It's best to be as clear as possible. So, start off explaining that you have a health condition or disability, that you are requesting an accommodation. We don't need to make it so the employer has to guess. And then, of course, offer any ideas you may have and be prepared to also discuss alternative options with the employer too. Now, once you've made your request, if a response isn't received in a reasonable amount of time, you want to follow up with the employer and find out what the delay is. If just kind of check in. There's no set time frame for that. It could be a week later, it could be 2 weeks later, whatever you're most comfortable with. And then, of course, if you do receive a response, let's say, for example, you don't get the response you're hoping for, maybe it's denied, try to find out more information about why that accommodation was denied and keep that conversation going so you can learn more about what to do next, whether it's talking about alternative solutions. That could be perhaps the next go-to. Maybe it's providing some additional information because the employer didn't have enough information. So there could be a lot to consider there. Now, Jan, of course, like I said, offers a lot of resources on how to request accommodation. So we would encourage you to take a look at those resources on the askjan.org website. Just go to the individuals page. All right, Lisa, I'm going to kick it back to you.
Yeah, so this is still honed in on an individual perspective. This is just a sample accommodation request related to a mental health condition to kind of illustrate this example. This comes from the sample language resource that Tracy just mentioned, and the link is in the chat. But this letter is brief, but it makes it clear that this employee is requesting accommodations due to medical issues affecting their mood, their sleep schedule, concentration, and focus. They go on to mention that workplace distractions are interfering with concentration and focus. And then they include the accommodation idea. They would like to try noise canceling headphones and having a to-do list to keep track of their work. So they brought up the work-related barrier, workplace distractions. They brought up the medical limitations, the focus, concentration, sleep schedule, and then they brought up their accommodation ideas. I also want to point out that they say they want these accommodations so they can perform better before performance starts to suffer. The timing of an accommodation request can be important because you don't want to wait until your performance issues arise and an employer can take disciplinary action because they don't have to rescind that disciplinary action if it happened before they were made aware of an accommodation need. So timing of an accommodation request could be important. Don't wait until it's too late. This request includes the essential elements of a clear request for an accommodation. And then on the flip side of that, from the employer perspective, for employers who didn't receive a documented written formal accommodation request or who like to have their documented requests on standard forms for consistency purposes, of course, Jan offers some sample forms that could help. We have the accommodation request form for the hiring process, and then a different accommodation request form for employers, which is the screenshot on this slide. These forms, they should be customized as you don't want to ask for information that you already have documented, that you already know. But these forms can enable employers to capture that essential information necessary to proceed down that interactive process. Okay, so before we get into, we're not even at the interactive process yet. So before we get into the interactive process, just some considerations for employers. I think it is better business practice for employers to create a workplace where people can feel comfortable asking for what they need to do their best work. That's what we all want to do, our best work. We want to ensure that disabled workers are included in all aspects of the workplace and know that it's a safe space and they can ask for accommodations if need be. And there's various ways that this could be done. One strategy is to establish a clear and accessible accommodation policy that outlines your company's commitment to accommodating those with disabilities. These company policies and procedures, they can help ensure that employees are informed and know the process. They can help promote consistency whenever you're processing requests. So having a company policy and procedure, you're not picking and choosing how you're going to process these requests. It's everyone goes through the same process and everybody knows what to expect. And having a formal policy and procedure, it can help document that an employer is trying to show a good faith effort and providing effective accommodations. Official policies and procedures, I'm saying formal policy and procedures, but they can also be flexible. They can be simple. They don't have to be complex or hard to navigate, and they shouldn't. The goal is to make it easier to provide job accommodations. The goal is to make it easier to receive reasonable accommodations to do your best work. So the policies and procedure that are super complex, super technical, overly rigid, complicated, that is not very helpful for anybody involved, really. And for more ideas, of course, we have the 5 practical tips for providing and maintaining accommodations that's linked. Okay, so now we are getting into the interactive process. So what is the interactive process? It's really just an open, ongoing, collaborative dialogue between the employer and the employee who requests accommodations. It's an informal process just to clarify what does the individual need in the workplace and and identify what could an accommodation possibly be. When an accommodation is not obvious, an appropriate accommodation is best determined through this flexible, you'll see that's a common thread, be flexible with everything, a flexible interactive process that typically involves analyzing the job to determine its purpose and those essential functions, those primary fundamental duties of a job role. It also involves consulting with the individual to see what job-related limitations are existing. How is this stemming from the disability? What are those restrictions and limitations? How can we overcome that limitation or restriction? Interactive process is, again, a collaboration to identify potential accommodations and assess, is this going to be effective or not? And then lastly, selecting and implementing an accommodation that is most appropriate for both parties. It needs to be effective in meeting the needs of the individual, but it also needs to be effective in performing those essential job functions. Um, we said that we can choose among effective options, but I think better business practice is to consider the individual's preference of accommodation initially. All right, here at Jan, sometimes we get asked, is a formal interactive process required? Do we absolutely have to do it? The answer is no. A formal process is not required, and it might be unnecessary depending on the circumstances. When the disability and the need for an accommodation is obvious, it might be relatively easy to just provide that accommodation without going through a formal interactive process. So we say start with an informal process, see what the individual needs, and identify an accommodation. And if it's easy enough to implement it, just implement it and keep it moving. Get that person back to work, get them doing their best work via easy to implement accommodations. So Tracy is actually going to get us into the details of a sample interactive process that we've come up with here at Jan.
Okay, yeah. So Jan offers a 6-step interactive process that's really just a sample framework, but it's not the only way to engage in the interactive process. And keep in mind, it's a sample interactive process, but it's not your workplace's interactive process. So always make sure that you're checking into what's happening in your own workplace. If you're a manager supervisor, check into what your policies and procedures are. As individuals, you also want to ask about that. Employers, of course, are free to develop and implement policies and procedures that really suit their organization. So it is okay to do that. Every accommodation process is unique, but many follow steps like acting when an accommodation request is recognized, then next gathering information to better understand the accommodation need, and then, of course, collaboratively exploring accommodations. The employer then chooses those accommodations and implements them. And then the final step is monitoring accommodations for effectiveness. And we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about some strategies related to each of these steps as we move forward. Of course, there's no accommodation process or solution that fits every situation, but each process really should begin with that collaborative dialogue. So get the conversation started. Try to figure out, what we need to know and what we need to do in order to move forward. When we start a collaborative dialogue, we're working to find solutions together. We must actively listen to each other. We must seek common ground and, of course, show mutual respect for one another in that process. Ultimately, the process involves openly discussing things like the specific aspects of the job that may be difficult, and of course, focusing on job functions rather than the health condition. So let's remember that it's really just about figuring out what work needs to be done, how are we going to get it done? Now, the individual will often identify specific accommodations that might be needed, but of course, both parties can and should suggest possible solutions because remember, it is collaborative. The employer should consider giving the employee an opportunity to share any relevant information without disclosing very specific, detailed medical information about their health condition. So get some general information. You may not want to be in a position of asking for very specific details about the disability because it may not be necessary. Gathering more details about the health condition and limitations is often a part of the process. We all know that. And Lisa, I think you have some key strategies to share related to requesting medical documentation. Is that right?
Of course I do. So, so yes, Tracy's right. Um, Requesting medical documentation is often a big component of this interactive process. Gathering information, it's step 2 of the sample interactive process that we have at JAN. But you want to first consider some strategies before asking for medical information. You want to first determine, is the request covered under current company policy? You don't want to require someone to provide medical documentation and go through this whole formal ADA interactive process if, as a business practice, it's offered to all employees, to those with or without disabilities. And so that could look like telework, that could look like flexible scheduling. Just because someone requested it and tied it to a medical condition doesn't mean you should now go through this formal interactive process where if Tom in the IT department can get telework for any willy-nilly reason, just as a benefit and perk of it being employed here, don't make it an ADA issue if your current company policy covers it. So first look at company policy. And this could also, we see this a lot with leave requests. If you have a company leave policy, go do that first. Don't make it an ADA issue if it doesn't need to be one. I touched on this with the JAN sample medical inquiry form. Assess what is already known, what is already documented about the health condition and need for an accommodation before requesting this open-ended medical documentation to be filled out. Employers are not supposed to ask for proof of disability when we've already established that a person has a disability or the disability is obvious. When choosing to request documentation, you want to be specific and ask honed-in questions of what kind of information are you seeking regarding the disability? But like Tracy said, you want to focus on really what are the limitations? What is impacting performing the job task? So learn about those functional limitations and how an accommodation can help overcome that restriction or limitation in the workplace. lastly, an alternative to requesting medical documentation, just have a discussion with the employee and the nature of their disability and limitations. It is possible to just accept an individual's assessment of their own health condition and their own limitations and defer to their accommodation preferences. Hey, how can we help you? What do you need to do your best work? And just have an open, collaborative conversation. I think we get so caught up in this process that we forget that we don't need to ask medical documentation if we don't want to. Medical documentation under the ADA is an entitlement. It is not a requirement. You are free to accommodate just based on an employee conversation. Um, of course, we have resources on this matter. We have a sample limited medical doc that really streamlines this process. It's really just asking for confirmation of, hey, does this person have a disability? It's not even getting into the details and diagnosis of this disability. It's just confirmation that this person is covered by ADA and that this accommodation is needed from this employee.
So do remember that, once we've gone through step two and we're trying to gather information, ultimately the employer is going to guide that interactive process conversation, right? You're sort of steering the ship a little bit here. You do want to make sure to approach the conversation that you're having with the individual with empathy and an open mind, ensuring that the employee feels supportive and supported in that process. As information is gathered, you can ask questions to help gain a general understanding of the situation. So we're sort of offering you some questions to consider along the way in the interactive process. These questions will change. These may not suit the situation, but we're just trying to give you some examples to consider. So for example, can you tell me about the challenges you're facing in your current role? This opens up the conversation about what specific aspects of the job may be difficult for that individual. Or how does your condition affect your ability to perform certain job tasks? This, of course, focuses on job functions rather than the specific medical condition. And is there anything you'd like to share about your condition that would help us better understand your accommodation needs? This gives the employee an opportunity to maybe share some relevant information, but remind them, of course, not to share real specific medical details when that information isn't necessary in the process. So just some questions to kind of get you started and starting that dialogue. Now, in response, as an employee, you'll want to engage with the employer in the process to provide clarity on your accommodation needs, connect your request to job performance, share any previous experience you may have had with accommodations in the past. That will help inform accommodation decision making moving forward. So those are just some things as an individual we want to think about. You hear us saying, try to be clear, include as much information as you can about the accommodation and why you need it, just to help the employer move that process along too. Now, as the parties collaboratively explore accommodation solutions, employers, please invite employees to share their ideas and to also please value their input. A common complaint among employees who are asked about their accommodation or interactive process experience is that their employer didn't value their input. So it's really important to demonstrate a willingness to find a solution that works for both parties and invite the employee to share their accommodation ideas. Also, we want to recognize the potential positive effect of workplace personalization. This is really just about tailoring the workplace environment to individual preferences where you can do that. With workplace flexibility, a lot of times employees, become aware of what their workplace needs are, their preferences, their styles, and this can inform accommodation decisions. And then, of course, you might need to consult internal and external resources like ergonomic experts, technology experts, vocational rehabilitation services, and other disability related organizations. And of course, the Job Accommodation Network as well, if you are needing help exploring accommodations. So we can certainly help you get on that path to identifying possible accommodation solutions. This exploration stage of the interactive process is really critical to finding effective solutions. So While you are exploring solutions, you might consider questions like what specific accommodations are you requesting? Of course, that provides clarity regarding the employee's needs. How do you think the requested accommodation will help you perform your job duties? It connects the request to job performance. And then also, have you tried any accommodations in the past that were helpful or not? This encourages the employee to share any previous experience with accommodations, and it helps the employer learn from previous experiences to help tailor that accommodation to the individual in an effective way. So, all of that can be helpful moving forward. Some additional questions we may want to ask about any tools, changes, or supports that the employee may believe could help them perform their job more effectively. It kind of enables the conversation to maybe draw out some details of what specifically may be needed. Or are you aware of any external resources or specialists who might help us understand how to best accommodate your needs? This invites collaboration with other professionals who can be part of your accommodation team. So that could also get you on a path to finding effective solutions. Now, as you're exploring and considering workplace adjustments, I think it's important to consider changes that anyone could request, like workplace flexibility, like Lisa was mentioning earlier, changes to the work environment, like adjusting temperature or lighting. If these things can be done, it might make it so that you won't need to necessarily go down the accommodation path. So you could maybe make some changes in the work environment and ask about whether those changes could be helpful in minimizing the impact of the individual's health condition. So it broadens that conversation to environmental changes. And as we explore accommodations, if there's more than one option, of course, we've said best practice is to try to consider the preference of the employee when it's possible to do so. However, that employer does get to choose among effective accommodation solutions, which can mean choosing a lower cost or less burdensome accommodation as long as it is effective. Now, sometimes employees are open to, of course, considering alternative solutions. Maybe the accommodation that was requested is really just not going to be a solution that works for both parties. So it's okay to ask whether the employee would be open to discussing alternative accommodation solutions than what's been requested. And of course, this still demonstrates a willingness to find a solution that works for both parties in this process. So again, keep that collaborative discussion going. Show a willingness to find solutions together. Lisa, can you share some common accommodations?
Of course. So the whole premise of exploring accommodations is being open to trying new things or a new way of doing things. Again, an accommodation is a change or modification to the way things are typically done. So I know we run a business and we've done the same thing for 30 years, but an accommodation might be a new way of doing something, but still accomplishing our business goals, our business needs, and it might even do it better. So there's not an exhaustive list of what's considered reasonable versus unreasonable. So this is just a list of common accommodations that we see a lot at JAN and under the ADA, making existing facilities accessible and usable. We see that a lot with ramp access to a physical building, job restructuring. That might be removing secondary or marginal tasks because we know under the ADA, we don't have to remove essential job functions as an accommodation. We might have to modify how we do those things. Modified schedules, there's lots of creativity with a schedule, limited schedule, modified schedule, flexible schedule. There's a lot of movement we can do with a schedule. Modifying a policy, that's where you kind of get into the dress codes we might need to modify or attendance policies. Acquiring or modifying equipment, work at home or telework, providing a service, and that could be a qualified reader for someone with a vision impairment, or it might be an interpreter for someone who is hard of hearing or deaf and uses American Sign Language, or a job coach for a person with a cognitive impairment, for example. Access for service or an emotional support animal, that often goes tandem with modifying a company policy on animals on the premise. And then an accommodation of last resort is typically this reassignment to a vacant position that someone is qualified for. Our first go-to should be to accommodate someone in their original current role. And then lastly on the slide is leave. Sometimes workplace accommodations won't let people meet their medical need and get the treatment they need. Some people are just incapacitated at times, so that could be extended leave or intermittent leave. There's not a set amount of leave under the ADA. It's grant leave until it poses an undue hardship. So to get into, if you need help exploring accommodation solutions, this is what we do here at Jan day in and day out. So we have an extensive website at askjan.org. So if you're new to Jan or have never been on the website, I would direct you to our A to Z of disabilities and accommodations as a starting point in this interactive process. You're going to find key accommodation solutions and various ADA information. And I like it as an employer because you can hone in on what you know. If you know the disability, you can go by the disability page. If someone didn't disclose the diagnosis or the disability, but you know they have a typing limitation, they have a lifting restriction, then you can go by limitation and see some accommodation ideas. So it really gives you tailored accommodation ideas based on what you have as information. I do want to give the disclaimer, just because it's on the askjan.org website doesn't mean it's covered by the ADA or it's not covered. This is, again, just a list of what our most frequent we get from our customers. There isn't an exhaustive covered list of ADA defined disabilities. I think Tracy's going to go into our newest feature on the AskJan website.
Yes, the Situations and Solutions Finder at askjan.org. It's a feature that provides free access to accommodation scenarios that have been shared by Jan users over many years. These are shared by employers, individuals, and employers and workers with disabilities can explore them to get ideas. Scenarios come from a wide range of organizations, both large and small, and do span various industries in the private and public sectors. The feature does allow users to filter results by disability, limitation, or occupation. You can also do keyword if you like. And you can even copy and save the results as a PDF or share them as a link if you'd like to do that. So it's a kind of a fun new place to look for accommodation ideas, possibilities. The Situations and Solutions Finder is not a comprehensive resource for accommodation information, though, so just kind of keep that in mind. It's a great starting point. It's a way to learn about the wide range of accommodation possibilities, but certainly you'd want to contact us to get more direct answers and assistance with your accommodation needs. So you can search Jan's Situations and Solutions at the askjan.org site. Now, when choosing accommodations, we're kind of in that step here of the interactive process. We do want to consider workplace personalization, flexibility, high impact changes. Think about maybe tailoring accommodation solutions because you want to work closely with the individual. Don't treat everyone as sort of a one size fits all type scenario. When it's possible, consider working remotely, allowing flexible hours. These are easy workplace changes, usually, that can enable somebody to work effectively. And of course, making small impact changes like providing ergonomic chairs, standing desks, adjusting lighting. These can be, low-cost solutions that can significantly impact employee comfort and productivity as well. So those are just some things to kind of keep in mind as you're choosing accommodations.
Yeah, so looking at that six-step interactive process, we're at step 4 out of the 6, choosing an accommodation. So like Tracy's mentioned, an employer can choose among effective options. They can offer or opt for the less expensive option as long as it's effective. That's the sticking point. It has to be an effective solution. You don't necessarily have to grant the requested accommodation or even the preferred accommodation, but better business, I think we should give an employee their preference in accommodation. We all like to pick out what we get at work. I picked out this chair, I want to pick out my desk, and accommodations are no different. So I think to show that good faith effort, let the employee with disability get their preference in accommodation when reasonable. Um, If it's not clear whether an accommodation is going to work, sometimes we're nervous. Oh, I can't approve that because I don't know if it's going to work or not. It could be possible to do a trial period, try out the accommodation. There's not a set time frame for providing a trial accommodation, but an employer, based on the circumstance in the industry, they might decide on a reasonable period for testing an accommodation. That could be anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months. It's really up to an employer to decide. So don't be scared to do a trial assessment of an accommodation if we're unsure it's going to be effective or it will meet our business needs. Temporary accommodations. This can help employees with time-limited conditions or temporary impairments. It can enable them to continue working while managing their limitations, or a temporary accommodation can get someone off of leave and get back to work sooner than anticipated. They can also help employers retain qualified, valued employees and avoid the expense of hiring and onboarding new employees. I mentioned at the start of this, we know hiring and onboarding can be very, very expensive. So if a temporary accommodation can help someone get back to work who knows the job in and out, that could be a win-win for both parties. Of course, we have a resource on providing temporary and trial accommodations linked here. And there's a sample form for documenting temporary accommodations. I think this is important just to get both parties on the same page of, hey, this is temporary. We're going to circle back at such and such date, just because memories fade and sometimes managers change. So having that paperwork that this is not necessarily long-term, but right now we're looking at it as a temporary accommodation, I think could be beneficial for all parties. Speaking of documentation, documentation during the interactive process in general can be important. Whenever an accommodation is chosen, I think it's important to communicate the approval of the accommodation. Same way, a denial should be communicated as well. I don't think it's a good idea to just leave employees out in the dark, unsure of the status of their accommodation. Did they get my accommodation request? Is it approved? Is it denied? So having that paper trail of whether it's approved, whether it's denied, or where that status is, I think could be helpful. Drafting a written accommodation agreement can also be recommended, just so the employer and the employee are again on that same page. We know next steps, we know what to expect moving forward in this process. Under the ADA, this is not required to document your effort to accommodate or to provide reasonable accommodation. It's just recommended as a better business practice, and it could be a vital way to demonstrate that we're trying to engage in the interactive process. We're creating that paper trail that, hey, I engaged with this person on such and such date. Here was the high points of the conversation, and what that kind of looked like of where did the accommodation land? Did we approve it? Did we deny it? What's happening? How long is it going to last? Of course, we have sample forms. With all our sample forms, they need to be customized um, uh, based on what you already have and what the circumstances are. But what if an accommodation is not going to be effective?
Now, of course, employers don't always have to provide the specific accommodation requested by an employee with a disability, but um, we sometimes do offer alternative solutions, right? And sometimes it's found by the individual that it's not going to be effective for them. So, as an individual, I think it is important to certainly let the employer know if you find an accommodation not to be working for you. So keep that accommodation process door open. Make sure that you are checking in. Let the employer know what's working and what's not. Same thing for the employer. Do your check-ins as well, as to try to make sure that the accommodation is working. Jan offers a resource on how to inform an employer that an accommodation isn't effective. So do check that out if needed. Now, once accommodations are chosen, they must be implemented. During this phase of the interactive process, employers may need to inform essential personnel about the accommodations when it's necessary. So, for example, a manager may need to know that a flexible schedule was approved so as not to penalize someone for coming in at a time that wasn't expected. Now, at all times, we want to keep personal health and accommodation information confidential and only shared with those who are, of course, on a need to know basis. And of course, you want to ensure that all necessary steps are taken to implement the accommodation. For example, this may include installing equipment or providing training on that equipment. It could be scheduling a service like CART or an interpreter. So just make sure you're doing all the things necessary to ensure that that accommodation is provided and available to that individual. It can help to have a point of contact who is responsible for monitoring the accommodation as well, just so we can make sure that, again, we're checking in. So, working with the employee, you may want to make it clear that the accommodation may need to be reviewed over time or adjusted, but we're going to check in, we're going to follow up, we're going to make sure that things are working as intended. You can ask questions like, how can we support you in evaluating the effectiveness of the accommodation? Or would you like regular check-ins to ensure that it's meeting your needs? So here you're just sort of creating an open line for future communication and adjustments along the way. So really important. We often say that monitoring is the most forgotten step in the interactive process, but we do want to make sure we're checking in. Now, of course, Lisa and I have just offered a really quick primer on the interactive process. We went through just sort of a sample framework for it. There could be a lot more to it, right? But we did include a lot of key strategies to consider along the way. Overall, we would like you to take away the idea that a successful interactive process really does hinge on effective communication. So while we're navigating the process to provide accommodation, we're offering some tips to consider to ensure that effective communication takes place. First, we want to collaborate to solve problems and find solutions that benefit everyone. We don't want to approach the conversation as adversarial. Assume that everybody wants an effective solution, and that's a good starting point. We want to be open and honest about any decisions, policies, and other information relevant to the accommodation process. This is where transparency is really crucial to effective communication. We also want to communicate clearly so everyone is on the same page. We know that even unintentional misunderstandings can lead to conflict. And so we don't want to be in that spot. We don't want to assume that someone knows what we mean. So, really, we want to be able to ask questions, provide answers, clear answers to those questions, and just be as open as we can. Of course, stay open minded and be adaptable and creative because accommodations are never one size fits all. Sometimes, we just need to remember to listen actively, to seek common ground, and really show mutual respect in that process. And just be open to exploring all kinds of solutions that could potentially work. And finally, consider temporary and trial accommodations as part of the negotiation. Lisa mentioned this. If you've attended a Jan webcast before, you have heard us talk about trial accommodations because we do see it as a way to sort of show willingness in the accommodation process, a way to be flexible in finding various solutions to explore. I think as both an employer and an individual, we need to be thinking about being flexible and trying out a solution. I know sometimes if an individual's preference wasn't selected and the employer is encouraging the individual to consider an alternative, as an individual, we encourage you to give it a try because you may find that it really could be an effective solution. It also shows that both parties are working together in that collaborative process. Looking at trial accommodations or, considering that's real important for both parties. And temporary accommodations as well. So, remember, sometimes people might be temporarily unable to perform certain duties. And so we may need to make adjustments that are just temporary in nature, but it sure is a great way to keep people working instead of perhaps being out. So if it's easy enough to do that, why not consider it? And we know that when an employee experiences the accommodation process as responsive and empowering and supportive, then the employee's performance and ultimately the entire workplace is likely to benefit. So we hope that these tips for communicating in a collaborative way will help you engage in that interactive process in a successful way and ultimately lead to good employment outcomes for everyone. Now, I'm going to just make note that we have included in the PowerPoint some interactive process conversations. I'm not sure, we might have enough time to quickly go through one of these, Lisa, just so we can kind of demonstrate this, and then we'll close things out real quickly after that. We only have about 5 minutes left in the webcast, but we just wanted to sort of give you a picture of what it might look like to go through an interactive process. And so here's scenario one, and we're going to do a little role play. I'm going to be the HR manager, and Lisa is going to be the employee in this situation. So here's how it goes. Manager, hi, thanks for meeting with me. I understand you've requested a flexible work schedule. Can you help me understand what specific challenges you're facing that a flexible schedule will help?
Right, yeah. I've been dealing with my anxiety, and some mornings are really tough for me. It makes it hard to get to work on time, and that in itself increases my stress. So, having flexibility when I start my day could help me manage better.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Lisa. I really appreciate your openness. Do you think starting later or having a more flexible range of start and end times would help you perform your job better?
Yeah, starting an hour later would really help a lot. It could give me time to manage my anxiety in the morning without worried about being late for my job.
Okay, that sounds reasonable. Would you need any additional adjustments, maybe at remote work or on particular days?
Remote work on the difficult days, that could definitely help, especially whenever I'm feeling overwhelmed.
Okay. Well, I think we can work on maybe setting up a later start time and allowing flexibility to work remotely on days when it's needed. How often do you think you'd need to work from home?
Maybe just like once or twice a week, depending how things are going.
Okay. Well, all right. I think we could give that a try and see how it works for you. We can also plan to check in periodically to make sure it's helping, maybe adjust as needed. Does that sound okay to you?
Yeah, that sounds really helpful. Thanks for understanding.
Of course, of course. Let's set a date in 2 weeks to review how it's going. Okay, that's our quick little role play. So basically, what we're trying to establish here is to just kind of show we've got this active listening involved. We've got good open-ended questions to kind of get a feeling for what the individual needs to establish the accommodations. We see a willingness to work together, to collaborate, to come up with solutions, the employer offering solutions as well as the individual. We see that there is an interest in getting started right away and trying to make sure that this person has what they need to do their best work. And then also we've got that check-in already. So this person was already right, headed right to the last step of monitoring the accommodation, right? Lisa, anything to add?
Yeah, you can just tell with the HR manager being open, it let the employee let my guard down so I can have an open dialogue. I wasn't intimidated. You were eager to help, and that made it easier to talk to as an HR manager, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, this is just an example. We have included two other scenarios in the PowerPoint just for your reference so that you can kind of get some other examples of what it might be like to go through an accommodation process or start that dialogue, right? I mean, these are obviously simplified for the training, but if you have questions or if you're looking for help working through the accommodation process, that's where we can help. So certainly keep Jan in mind. We can work with you in that process. It's all the time that we have today for the content of this training. We do hope that it was informative, and we thank you very much for attending. Just a reminder, all Jan webcasts are recorded and made available in the Jan webcast series library. That's available at the Jan training page at askjan.org. The next Jan webcast is scheduled for Thursday, April 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and is titled Go To Workplace Accommodation Solutions. It will include an overview of common go-to accommodation options for motor, cognitive, neurological, and sensory limitations. Registration for this event will open 1 month in advance. You may register either for the live event or the recording only option. This is something new that we're offering. Those who register for the recording only will receive the recording about a week after the live event. For more information, please go to the training page at askjan.org. And attendees, if you have any questions about workplace accommodations, the interactive process, remember you can ask Jan. We didn't do a Q&A today, so we please encourage you to contact the Jan service directly for free and confidential consultation. Go to that askjan.org website. You can use the live chat or give us a call at 800-526-7234 or email us at jan@askjan.org. Finally, if you care to follow, you can follow us on social media, Job Accommodation Network on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and Janet Jan on X. With that, thanks for joining us today. Lisa, thanks for joining me in this today. And this concludes our Jan training today. Take care, everyone.